All right, welcome everyone. Boa tarde, buenas tardes. We can move to the next slide. Well, first, sorry, I'll go with some logistics. So welcome to this webinar organized by IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And we're very happy today to be able to provide simultaneous interpretation in both Portuguese and Spanish. So for those of you who would like to listen to the webinar in Portuguese or Spanish, please select the corresponding language by clicking on the interpretation or little planet icon located at the bottom of your screen. I will also like to inform you all that we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. We'll take questions in written form. And so you can use the Q&A function of Zoom. This is also located at the bottom of the screen. And we'll make sure we have enough time at the end of the session to answer as many as we can. I think we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm Pierre de Pasquale. I'm IRMA's Standards Director and talking to you from Paris, France today. The topic of this webinar is the IRMA Draft Chain of Custody Standard. And really the starting point for this new IRMA standard is the importance that mining and mined materials play in our everyday lives. We use mined materials every day. We use them in the services we use, the goods we use, whether they are infrastructures, transport, health, even the food we eat, and of course, other, cars, electronics, defense systems. And we want to know, and I think we've seen at IRMA the global push to know where these materials come from, the same way we do with other commodities and everyday products, such as, the electricity we use or the water that we drink or use for industrial processes. And we also want not only to know where they come from, but to ensure that these raw materials have been extracted according to the greatest environmental and social standards, to make sure that these were extracted in a responsible manner. And so the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, as many of you would know, has got a standard for responsible mining currently being revised as a standard for responsible mining and mineral processing that is open for public comment. And this standard really sets out these best practices and requirements for any mining entity to be able to demonstrate that the management is done in a responsible way. But what this standard now, the chain of custody standard, is designed for is really to set out specific requirements for tracking material from these independently assessed, verified IRMA mines or mineral processing entities and track them to the market along the supply chains to enable downstream purchasers, users, transformers to operate and make credible claims about the IRMA achieving levels and the responsible standard and requirements that have been met by these entities. And we've seen the push really from, in particular, downstream customers, purchasers, and consumers across all sectors, from, I mentioned some of them earlier, jewelry and luxury goods, cars, electronics, infrastructures, health, and defense. So we really want to help build value and hold expectations along mineral value chains. And I will now turn to my colleague Christy Disney Bruckner, our Law and Policy Director, to take you through some of the generalities and more detailed overview of the standard. Thank you, Christy.
Thank you, Pierre. And we can move to the next slide. In this next hour, we will give you a more detailed overview of the chain of custody standard. This is the second draft chain of custody standard that IRMA has shared for public comments. And the reason that we have a second draft is because, based on input from entities across the supply chain and a range of stakeholders, we really needed to have more flexible material accounting options. And we will deep dive into what those are and what we've learned through supply chain studies to inform the material accounting methodologies in the chain of custody standard. And before you leave, we'll make sure you know exactly how to comment on the standard. We have a range of flexible options for you. And we'll take your questions as well, as Pierre said, throughout this presentation. So please continue to write your comments in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to answer as many of those as we can before we end today. And hope this is really the start of a conversation with you, especially if you are new to IRMA and the IRMA standard framework. Reach out to us, and our job at the IRMA Secretariat is to provide educational materials, trainings for you to respond to your questions, and above all, to make sure that your knowledge and experience and concerns and objectives are reflected in our standards, including the chain of custody standard. In the next slide, I'll give a brief overview of the objectives of the chain of custody standard. In the next slide, and we can click through a few points here. But above all, our objective is to have an agreed framework that provides the baseline requirements for tracing any IRMA audited material from the mine site down to the end user. And this is part of our commitment to prevent greenwashing in any way, to create more transparency that goes even beyond the mine site level. And we see a demand for this that is based on many decades of work from civil society, from labor, organized labor, from NGOs and affected communities, calling for higher level standards at the mine site level, but also making considerations and sourcing requirements that can be traced to a mine that has been audited by IRMA. And we see that demand show up in regulations that are emerging around the world, in the European Union and beyond, and from demands from investors and purchasing companies as well. So this is the framework that really helps to trace those IRMA audited materials that have been audited against the IRMA standard for responsible mining, and all of the 400 plus requirements on environmental and social topics and beyond that are in the IRMA standard, and make sure that those materials are traced through supply chains to the end consumer. And we can click through a couple more times to show really these two objectives. One, that we want to provide entities across the supply chain with a common set of requirements. Also, we want to make sure that these requirements can be independently audited to provide objective evidence for the flow of IRMA achieving materials through the supply chain. In the next slide, you'll see, as Pierre noted, that our standard system is expanding from covering the mine site to going to different parts of the life of mining, starting with exploration and development, through mineral processing for standalone mineral processors. And this chain of custody standard is a separate standard that is used to trace material from the mine site level to the end user. So that's our focus today, is the chain of custody standard. Moving to the next slide. We based our work on chain of custody on a series of supply chain studies. And the next slide, you'll see here, IRMA is really scaling at the moment to cover additional mine sites in additional countries and a wide range of materials. Currently, 100 sites are engaged in the IRMA system, and we see this growing on a regular basis, covering over 29 countries and 52 materials. In the next slide, you can see our coverage of independent IRMA audits around the world, covering audits in 8 countries by 9 companies. And this is for independent audits. We have many mines that you'll see in the next slide. If we go to the mining industry combined engagement in IRMA through self-assessments, through piloting draft standards, and through independent audits, we're covering a range of jurisdictions around the world. We have brought on experts who are taking a regional focus in Africa to expand our work in Africa. We will be onboarding a lead for Asia as well, as we focus on engagement in Indonesia and China and beyond. And we have longstanding engagement in North America and Latin America, South America, and the Caribbean. And we'll continue to expand our secretariat service across jurisdictions and also across sectors. So we have sector-specific staffers who keep us accountable to each sector engaged in IRMA. In the next slide, you'll see the types of material we have focused on in the initial set of supply chain studies that make up the annex to the chain of custody standard. And we can click through these 5 materials we prioritize because they have gone through or are soon going through independent third-party IRMA audits to be available in the marketplace as IRMA audited material. And those are PGMs, iron ore, nickel, lithium, and graphite. We'll continue to expand our supply chain studies and hope that you will let us know if there are particular supply chains you would like to see us study. If you have comments on those materials in the annex based on your experience. But we also hope that sharing our work on these studies helps to achieve our goal of greater transparency. And they are just examples. There are many different types of supply chains, but we have shared what we've learned. In the next slide, we'll turn to the options for material accounting in this second draft of our chain of custody standard. And we can click through these 5 points in this slide for the 5 different types of material accounting that are covered in the chain of custody standard. And we'll go through each one in detail. And what we commonly think of as chain of custody, it is really these first 2: identity preserved, where materials or products originate from a single source; segregated material, where we're able to set aside material with an IRMA achievement level; And these are very challenging types of material accounting, very uncommon, I should say, in supply chains that we have studied. So we're seeing a greater need for these next three sets of material accounting methodologies that include controlled blending, that include a mass balance approach. And we have also added in this chain of custody draft a book and claim methodology. And we see this needed where there isn't necessarily a connection to a physical flow of material, but where there's a high level of mixing and trading of material. The book and claim model can support bringing greater transparency and greater participation in the IRMA system. And we'll continue to talk with you in this webinar about why we think it's needed, how we would manage claims related to this methodology of book and claims, and what we're hearing from entities across the supply chain about why this might be needed. As IRMA continues to grow and more IRMA audited material comes into the marketplace, this methodology may not continue to be a priority for our chain of custody standards. So we see it as an interim measure and may likely transition away from using it if it is adopted in our chain of custody standard. We'll turn to the next slide and also turn to my colleague, Jim Kuipers, who will give you a more detailed overview of each of these material accounting methodologies.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Kuipers again, and I'm a mining and mineral processing engineer who's been working with IRMA for pretty much the last 15 years, and recently had the opportunity to work with IRMA on putting together the chain of custody standard that we're discussing today. When I get done explaining these 5 different models, I want to take a couple of minutes and go to an iron flow sheet that shows how iron is produced, as well as a lithium flow sheet that shows how lithium is produced. And I think it'll help to actually explain some of these figures a little bit more illustratively, so that you can see how they might apply to different types of actual metal flow streams. But something very interesting, or very important, I should say, to recognize, and Christy has mentioned it, as well as Pierre, is that the purpose of the chain of custody is, number one, to allow IRMA claims to be made, and that IRMA producing material to then be tracked through the system. The chain of custody is not the IRMA standard and doesn't ask the questions or have the requirements, if you will, of the IRMA standard, but rather the intent is, once you have something produced in an IRMA mine, such as we're showing on this first figure, it discusses how you ensure that the downstream processing, distribution, and manufacturing is tracked or traced in such a manner that the end product actually contains, or otherwise is acknowledged as not containing, the IRMA produced material, consistent with how it's actually being produced back at the mine site. So that's a very important aspect to recognize in this chain of custody. The other is that we needed these 5 different chain of custodies because of the diversity in the mining and minerals production industry. We have some commodities, and I'll show you iron ore is a good example, where you have multiple mines feeding, for example, one smelting facility. That smelting facility then may feed products from multiple smelting facilities to a refinery, and ultimately the end product might contain different pieces or parts, if you will, from as many as 10, 20, even hundreds of mines in some of these cases. There are other cases where it's quite different, and we'll talk about those as well. And so that really starts us and gets us to figure 1 that I'm showing here in terms of the other mines that are different from what we'll talk about at the end. The kind of ideal model would be one where when you purchase the end product, you can say lithium, for example, in that end product, be it a battery used for an automobile or used for a phone or otherwise. But the lithium in that end product actually comes from a particular mine, and you would know what that mine's IRMA achievement level is, and everything else about it that you wanted to know by looking at an IRMA audit. That situation isn't something that exists for things like iron ore, copper, various base metals, and other things. It may exist for, and hopefully will exist for, some things like lithium. What I'm showing here is an example of an IRMA identity preserved model where we have an IRMA 75 mine that's producing lithium. It goes through the downstream processing, distribution, and manufacturing steps. For example, there are many steps going from the mine before you actually get to lithium that you use in a battery. And as it goes through those steps, in this case, there's no additional material, either IRMA material or non-IRMA material, entering that processing, distribution, and manufacturing chain of custody. And therefore, when you get to the end, you can in fact say that the lithium used in this battery is IRMA 75 sourced from a particular project and a particular company. And this really would be the ideal that many consumers, most consumers would like to be able to know where the material I'm using comes from. So go to figure 2. In the case of figure 2, there's really not a big change. It's called the IRMA segregated model. That model really allows for more than one mine to come in. And essentially, when you look at it here, in this case, we're showing 2 IRMA 75 mines with the identical claim. We're also saying that there isn't any outside contamination by non-IRMA sources of any kind in the downstream processing, distribution, and manufacturing. But when you make the claim in this case, you can't actually make the claim for a particular mine, but you can make a claim such as for the company. So that's where the end user claim would be that the lithium used in this battery is IRMA 75 from Company X, that Company X being the owner of these 2 different mines. So now we can go to the next. And I might mention, just take a moment, you might notice on the title of each one of these figures, I've mentioned adapted from the ISO standard number 22095-2020. Very important for you to note that we've really followed this ISO standard in formulating the chain of custody. And so it's something that if you want more information, want to see how this all came about, understand better what's involved, I would encourage you to actually obtain that ISO standard. So this is the third chain of custody model. It's the controlled blending model. And what this model essentially allows is mixing from an IRMA source with a non-IRMA source. And in this case, I'm focusing on recycled material because, as many of you are aware, there's a focus on trying to get as much recycled material back into the product stream as we can, particularly if it can actually reduce the need for new production of product. And so we see that being something that is popular and is probably going to increase in popularity over time. Right now, today, IRMA does not certify or give recycled material achievement levels. As you can imagine, trying to trace the actual recycled material through its product chains and everything else is something that right now would require a whole different probably standard as well as chain of custody. But we would certainly welcome the idea of recycled material being blended with IRMA producing material. So here what we're showing is 75% of the material going into this mix would be from an IRMA 75 mine, and then 25% would be recycled material. Again, those materials would be kept separate through the downstream processing, distribution, and manufacturing steps. And then the end user claim would be that the lithium in this battery is 75% IRMA 75 and 25% recycled material. I would suggest this would be a end user claim that would have a lot of popularity with essentially the public and others, with the idea not only is material from IRMA, but if it's not from IRMA, it's actually recycled material. So go to the next slide. Now, what I talked about in the previous remodels, that's something that exists perhaps for some commodities, likely to exist for more commodities in the future. But the reality is that the minerals and metals producing community, what they have done for years, basically it's how they account for their production, as well as their efficiencies and their costs and everything else, is to perform a mass balance model that it actually tracks or traces, if you will, the mineral that they're producing. And let's say, for example, it might be platinum group metals, it might be nickel, could be lithium, but essentially takes and traces that from the extraction source, from the mine, the well, whatever that source may be, and goes through the various at-site processing steps, as well as processing steps at downstream processors, and continues to track not only the recovery of the metal, but also any losses of the metal. And you have losses that occur at the mineral processing, that occur at the mine, but you also have losses that occur at downstream steps, like in smelting, refining, manufacturing creates losses of metals. Some of it's recycled, some of it isn't. And so the idea is that using the same methodologies that industry already is using to account for the materials through their systems, but making sure that they tie from part to part to part of the system, that's the idea of the mass balance model. And so it's something that right now can be applied to many different circumstances of industry production for battery and other metals. It has two different implementation methods that I show here and that I'll actually talk about more on the next two slides. So why don't we go ahead and go to those slides. So the two implementation methods, the first of them is the rolling average percentage implementation method. Sorry for the long, kind of lengthy titles on these, but the reality is, in order to describe them, you need those. So the idea here, though, is over, for example, a 6-month period, you take the material that comes in on average, and you go back and say, on average over that 6-month period, this is what we actually got, for example, for IRMA material. So what I'm showing here is a situation that is not, I'm going to say, untypical to what presently we would see with a lot of different metals. And that's where we might have a few IRMA mines, and the idea is to have more and more IRMA mines, and as time goes by. But we have our IRMA 75 mine here, and we have an IRMA 50 mine here. And in these cases, we're actually showing that the IRMA 75 mine might produce 40 to 50% of the input, and the IRMA 50 mine might produce 25 to 30% of the input. The remaining input would come from a non-IRMA mine, and that could be 25 to 30% in this example, as well as from recycled material. And I just showed this as, for example, being 10 to 20%. So all these materials are blended together, if you will, in downstream smelting and refining or other chemical processing is another good example, processes. And they're kept separate from other materials outside of what we know is here, which then allows us to have an end product. Now, you might notice I'm showing this end product on the right-hand side as containing both the IRMA material, the non-IRMA material, and the recycled material. And that's, in fact, the way the end product would be blended. And what you do in the case of the rolling average percentage method is you acknowledge that blending. And at the end of the day, your user claim would be what I'm showing here in terms of claiming lithium in this battery is X% IRMA achieving material. In this case, it could be, for example, a maximum 80% IRMA achieving material. It could then be also 10% recycled material. And the X% that I'm suggesting here is the mass balance average percentage IRMA achieving over the last 6 months. Now, the only messy thing about this is the number, the X% I'm showing here, it might be for one 6-month period, 41%, another one, 53%, another one, 37%. It would be changing for every 6-month period. And it would essentially, while you could make that claim for X%, it would kind of be rolling around all the time and difficult even to put on a label. So if you go to the next figure, so the alternative is the credit method. And this, in fact, is very popular with industry. What makes sense for industry also makes sense for downstream producers, manufacturers, and is something that the end users can also understand in terms of a claim. So what we have here is the same exact situation in terms of inputs with an IRMA 75 mine, an IRMA 50 mine, a non-IRMA mine, and recycled material. But the difference is, as when it's produced, we separate out the non-IRMA end product from the IRMA end product. In reality, they're mixed. We kind of separate them out in terms of what we sell to the end user. So the best example I can give you is if you had a situation where the 80% that we're talking about out of 10,000 kilograms was 8,000 kilograms of IRMA producing material, with 2,000 kilograms being either non-IRMA mine material or recycled material. Well, then you could make the end user claim that the lithium in this battery is IRMA achieving material for that 8,000 kilograms. The 2,000 remaining kilograms you could make no claim for with respect to IRMA whatsoever. So this allows a way, instead of saying 80% of this material is IRMA, you can say 100% is IRMA, but the producer can only sell that true 80% that's contained. And so this is something that, again, it allows for a end user claim that's more meaningful, kind of more clear than just describing a percentage. But at the same time, the way we make it valid is to ensure that only the IRMA end product percentage that's in fact produced and goes into this stream is allowed for that claim. So now we'll go to figure 6, which is the last of these book and claim models. And this is really the most controversial in that it allows for a chain of custody model in which there is not necessarily any connection to the physical flow of material or product through the supply chain. And to make that real clear, this shows again the same situation I showed for the mass balance models. But instead of there being a direct line from the downstream processing, distribution, and manufacturing, what we're showing instead of it is a dash line from those IRMA 75 mines to an IRMA end product or an end product that has an IRMA claim. And that end user claim would allow for them to say the lithium in this battery is IRMA achieving material. But you notice I've emphasized in red and underlined, based on a book and claim model, and may not include physical presence of IRMA achieving material. So in the same way, you could use the different methodologies we talked about for mass balance to establish the quantity of IRMA end product material, but they would have to include this label. I might mention that the industry folks we've talked to that are selling materials, they really would rather not see this label included. But I'd also say the civil society people we've talked to about this model have made it clear, and as a general standard, when you look at how civil society has treated these different chain of custody models, it's been made clear that if you're going to use this type of model, the book and claim model, then you actually need to make it very clear that it does not include that physical presence, such as we're suggesting here. And so that's one of the ways that I think we would hopefully have industry over time decide that, because they would prefer to have the end users really want to be able to establish a higher claim, they would encourage industry to not continue to use this type of model any longer than necessary, and to, as time goes on, if you will, take their practice and move it so it can use these more clear physical presence of metal models we showed earlier. So let's just go down for a brief moment to our other two. Just wanted to show the iron ore if we could at the end. Oops, okay. Let's just go to lithium. Okay, So just wanted to explain very briefly to folks, and I apologize for how busy this slide is, but a little bit more about how this chain of custody model works. So you see at the top here, we've got company A, IRMA mine, company A, non-IRMA mine, non-IRMA mine, company A, IRMA mine, brine site, etc. Now, it's at that brine site or the mine that the actual IRMA achievement is reached. And the mine site includes the next step, which would be flotation concentration for mines and evaporation concentration for brine sites. Those are all done at the IRMA site where there's mining and mineral processing taking place. Now, when we go down to the next nodes, which show additional concentration, chemical processing in two different lines, those chemical processing nodes probably aren't going to be at the IRMA site. And they may or may not actually have an IRMA achievement level associated with them. But what the chain of custody does is make sure that as it goes from the mine site, following the mine site processing, that the chemical processing is the next step, that there is actually traceability from the mine to the chemical processing. And then as a next step from the chemical processing, you go down and you can see where you have traders and brokers and warehouses. Now, one thing most of us don't realize is when we actually produce something like lithium hydroxide or lithium carbonate that we're showing here, those aren't pure products. Those impure products, if you will, are typically sold, traded, exchanged, warehoused for some period of time, sold again, warehoused again. All that needs to be continually tracked. There need to be certain things done to ensure that there's a mixing or commingling that occurs at those places. So that's also what the IRMA chain of custody addresses. And then you see a fabrication step down here, down at the very bottom. And that fabrication step is one more step in which the IRMA chain of custody ensures that there is, in fact, a traceable or trackable way to ensure that the IRMA material is continuing down that process. So just to give you some idea of what the intent of the chain of custody is, it's again to take what's at the very top of this graph and ensure that the end product producer or consumer, when they're buying something with a particular claim being made, that in fact that claim is valid going through all these different steps through the production process. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Christy.
Thank you, Jim. I wanted to take a moment to talk in a bit more detail, and Jim has explained very clearly using this example from our supply chain study, the role, just as one example, the role of traders and brokers. And if we go back a few more slides to the rationale for book and claim, I'll share with you really 3 points of rationale for the book and claim model. And largely, we see this as being necessary where supply chains for certain materials, including those that we studied, involve mixing material from multiple mine sources. Now, this might be mixing material from one or more IRMA achieving mines. It might be mixing with non-achieving mines, and it might also be mixing with recycled material. So in the examples that Jim has walked through, you've seen boxes with non-IRMA material, boxes that are called recycled content. And we're recognizing where it's non-IRMA material, where it's IRMA audited material, where it is recycled material, and will be creating transparency around that supply chain. Not allowing a book and claim system would require physically segregating IRMA audited material. And in some cases, that's possible where there's a very direct supply chain. We've seen this in some smaller jewelry supply chains, for example, but largely for the supply chains that we have studied, they are very complex. And even the example that Jim walked you through, giving examples that are generalized for lithium that vary widely from site to site and supply chain to supply chain, you get a sense of how complex supply chains are. In the second point, I will note a point of rationale that a lot of supply chains rely significantly on processes that include in the supply chain tolling, brokering, trading, warehousing, shipping from multiple sources. So maintaining segregation of IRMA and non-IRMA materials would require extraordinary modification of existing practices that could be very expensive. So for one example, if you are just looking at the mineral processor site, imagine having to stop a processor, take all of the material out, only put IRMA audited material in, start the processor again, and be storing material in separate buildings and accounting for it separately. It is very costly, whereas most of the processors and supply chains are using an ongoing continuous process. So the shift wouldn't be practical for most supply chains right now. But again, as we see more IRMA audited material come into the marketplace, it may alleviate reliance on this type of model and make it easier to use some of those other models that are more appealing for consumers wanting a more direct supply chain. And the third point I will make is that we've seen a lot of chain of custody models, a lot of chain and custody standards are available but not being utilized. So we questioned, as we met with different entities, what are some of the challenges around using existing models? And they just were not flexible enough for using and tracking these more complex supply chains. So we really want to see a chain of custody standard that is used, that is practical, that is enhancing transparency of supply chains, and that is really holding the credibility of IRMA audited material and our objective of bringing more sites into the IRMA system and more IRMA audited material into the marketplace. And the next slide, we'll turn to sharing how to comment. So I'll turn over to my colleague, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christy. And thanks, Jim, also for the very detailed and comprehensive walkthrough. So everything that you've heard and seen, and everything that you will read in the draft standard that you can find on our website, and I have put the link in the chat, is up for review and public comments. Well, next slide. Yes. So we have opened this draft standard for a public comment consultation period of 90 days. So this is running up until January the 26th next year. And this is really an invitation and a great opportunity for everybody to contribute, to send concerns, suggestions, comments, feedback on both the rationale and the approach and these models that we're proposing in the chain of custody standard, but also on specific requirements and the topics that we're addressing and how we are suggesting to address them. And this is really an important moment for IRMA and for all of you, because all these comments will be treated equally and objectively. We will review them. We will spend a lot of time trying to find the best way to reflect and articulate expectations of all stakeholders. And there are many ways for you to contribute or participate. Probably the easiest way for you is to send your formal comments and contribution via email. We have a dedicated email address, which you can see on the screen, comments@responsiblemining.net. You can also use our WhatsApp line and number or the physical address of IRMA. So this is for really formal contribution and comments. All the comments we receive, we will include them in a public summary at the end of the consultation period, and when we will be submitting our revised final version to the public, we will include a public summary of all the comments. And it is possible for you to ask for your names and affiliation and comments to be treated confidentially if you wish to. And you only need to let us know and mention it in your contribution. Of course, there are also a number of perhaps more informal ways for you to contribute, such as this webinar. We had a webinar already this morning with already a number of contributions and questions. IRMA is going to hold a number of events and sessions over the coming weeks and months. So it will also be an opportunity for you to contribute. And I would like to also mention and address one of the questions that was, has been asked today on the role of the board of directors of IRMA. In this process, we had a slide that showed, that in particular, the book and claim model is really brand new compared to the first draft version that was published in 2021. So obviously the board of IRMA will have to, sign off on the final version. But as Christy mentioned in the Q&A, it's really the whole standard that will still need to go through board's final approval. I'll turn to Christy maybe back if there's anything you want to add, and I really encourage you to keep sending your questions into the Q&A. Maybe one question already that I see for Christy and Jim, and really looking at this very detailed flow chart that summarizes the lithium production supply chain, and make no mistake, this is really not an unusual example. So is the intent of the standard to be applicable at various steps in this supply chain? We see the pre-concentration, the concentration, the transformation, commodity traders and customers. Is this standard only applicable for the very end users, or are there other entry points along the supply chain?
I would suggest literally all the entry points in the supply chain without exclusion.
That's very clear. Christy, anything you want to add?
Nothing I want to add. I think, as we have done these supply chain studies, and as many who are experts on tracking and tracing supply chains, the most complex stage is often at the mineral processing level. So a lot of our conversations have focused around how do we really move and track and trace through the mineral processor. And what we want to do now is recognize that our goal is to enhance transparency, including where there may be gaps in the supply chain, to track across as many entities as possible, try to create a complete supply chain. But let's start with more transparency and continue to improve as we go. And again, the objective of this really being to protect the value of IRMA audited material as it moves through supply chains, and in complement to that, to recognize the importance of bringing in more recycled and scrap content. IRMA is very dedicated to promoting circularity approaches and moving toward a circular economy. And that means finding ways to responsibly bring in recycled and scrap content. So this is something that we are considering with many groups of experts working on the same questions around the world. But we will really invite your expertise as well, and any additional comments, questions that you have. We're interested in anything that's coming up for you, but in particular, what do you think about the book and claim model? What do you think about the other models? What questions do you have about claims that come out of any of these material accounting methodologies? We will be standing by to take your comments, questions, and recommendations.
Thank you, Christy. And I think there has been questions also around, and as you know, most of you and many of you would be aware, there has been a growing number of regulations, norms, policies in the space, and particularly led by the European Union. But we can also think of, modern slavery acts that have been enforced for a number of years in the UK and Australia. And Jim mentioned the ISO norm as maybe a reference point. How do you, could you explain if there's, any attempt to further align or reflect or integrate some of these considerations in the draft standard?
Yeah, Christy, you're actually more familiar with the larger picture of what's going on.
I can share. So Jim mentioned that he has referenced an ISO standard and this chain of custody standard. And at IRMA, we do our very best to integrate existing international frameworks and, to the extent possible, to avoid duplication of efforts. And we learn a lot from other international frameworks and look for ways to be compatible. And ISO often comes up because it is a norm for many in the industry. So we see ISO standards referenced in the IRMA standard for responsible mining and mineral processing, and the IRMA chain of custody standard, and in our auditing requirements as well. On a broader scale, we see a lot of new regulations emerging, some existing that are becoming more detailed and requiring more of entities across the supply chain to deepen due diligence. And our aim at IRMA as a voluntary standard system is that we see a priority for reflecting requirements and high-level standards for the mining sector and mineral processing and exploration and due diligence of supply chains in legal frameworks where they can be enforced through rule of law. So we see our standards and systems as being a complement to that important role of government and not a replacement for those in any way. But we do see that reports from an IRMA audit, and we envision as well that where chain of custody audits take place and are transparently reported, this is evidence based on a report prepared by an independent third party that is useful for an entity to show its alignment with good practice, to demonstrate to stakeholders, rights holders, investors, purchasing companies, their performance and their continuous improvement. But it is not a replacement for rule of law and the level of enforcement and review of due diligence that is required. It is a tool in the toolkit, and we're aiming to make it as compatible as possible with legal frameworks and other systems, including ISO.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christy. There are a few other questions. I see there's one in the Q&A right now, and maybe this is for you, Jim. I know Christy mentioned, blockchain and possible technologies that may be used. And we have a question here about, GIS, geographic information system, or remote sensing.
Yeah, so the question is it possible to track the minerals using a geographic information system? And I would actually suggest if we're just being asked today, is it possible? I don't think it is. I don't think there's any system or anything else set up out there right now today that does this. However, if you have a chain of custody and you allow that information from that chain of custody to be used, you could use that to set up a GIS layer that would contain, for example, from an IRMA producer, how that actual material flowed through the different countries, if you will, or areas, places where it's going through those different downstream steps, and ultimately ends up with an end producer. And you could show that, for example, from lithium going through for a car, ultimately from the source all the way through. So the information could be used to create a layer that then could be put on GIS, certainly. And of course, it would be accommodating more so in doing that, probably, if it did include elements of blockchain and other things like that.
Yes, and it's such a great question. There are so many existing and emerging technologies, and we aim to be compatible with blockchain and other technologies, but we are not requiring use of any specific platform or technology. We want this to be useful in a wide range of circumstances, including for small industrial scale mines and small short supply chains to the most complex supply chains that we have studied in our research that you'll see appear in the index, the annex of the chain of custody standard.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. And maybe we have time for one final question that we had through the registration form, and it's around the assurance or verification process. And I think it's important maybe to re-emphasize or remind everyone that within the draft standard, there's also a proposed verification process with a summary of the different steps. But I imagine, and maybe Christy, you want to say more about it, that there'll be time spent and efforts to develop an actually more detailed and robust assurance process once the standard's finalized, isn't it?
Yes, and we are working on pilots to field test the types of auditing that will be done. When it comes to independent third-party audits, we'll be developing guidance specifically for the chain of custody standard, and recognize that right now we have independent third-party auditors that we call certification bodies that are approved to conduct audits under the IRMA standard for responsible mining. The skill set involved in doing an independent third-party audit of chain of custody is different. So we recognize that we will need to provide specific guidance and specific training for our auditing teams on this topic. So that is underway and will parallel our final version of the chain of custody standard. If you have done any type of auditing of chain of custody standard, if you have recommendations, if you have case studies from your experience, we really welcome you to inform us. We're really learning from the experience of entities across the supply chain and a wide range of experts who are working on this topic.
Thank you so much, Christy. And I see that we are just at the top of the hour. So I'd like to thank my fellow speakers and teammates. Also would like to thank the interpreters for their great work today. And I would like to thank you all for having attended this session and webinar. And we really look forward to receiving your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Thank you very much.